For nearly 80 years, a single question has echoed in workshops, at air shows, and in the quiet halls of VFW posts. It's a question of steel, of horsepower, and of sheer, unadulterated nerve. What was the fastest propeller-driven fighter aircraft of the Second World War? Today, we're not dealing in hangar gossip or barroom bets. We are setting the record straight. But to do that, we have to agree on the rules. Fastest is a dangerously simple word for a very complicated problem. Are we talking about speed at sea level, where the air is thick as soup, or up at 30,000 feet in the thin, frozen air where the bombers flew? Are we talking about a clean, stripped-down airframe in a test flight, or a battle-hardened machine loaded with guns, ammunition, and a pilot desperate to get home? The truth is, speed was a weapon, and it was specialized. The fastest plane at 5,000 feet might be a sitting duck at 35,000. So to find the true king of speed, we must look at the official test data, the declassified wartime reports, and find the machine that pushed the laws of physics to their absolute breaking point. This isn't just a list. This is an investigation into the most advanced piston-engine aircraft that ever saw combat or were built to see it. These are the thoroughbreds, the machines that represented the last glorious roar of the propeller before the jet age changed everything. We begin our search in the one place that drove the desperate need for speed more than any other: the cold, hostile skies above 30,000 feet. By 1944, the American 8th Air Force was punching deep into Germany, and the Luftwaffe had a terrible existential problem. Their standard fighters, the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, were excellent brawlers down low, but up in the thin air their engines gasped. Their performance fell off a cliff, leaving them vulnerable to the American escorts and struggling to intercept the high-flying B-17s. Germany needed a new kind of hunter. They needed a Hochleistungsjäger, a high-performance fighter. The answer came from one of the greatest aviation minds in history, Kurt Tank. His solution was the Focke-Wulf Ta 152H. This aircraft was a different animal entirely from the butcher bird it was based on. You can see it immediately in those wings. They are impossibly long and slender, stretching to nearly 48 feet. This was a glider's wing, designed to grip the thin air molecules and provide lift where there was almost none. But a wing like that needs power, immense power. The Ta 152H was built around the Jumo 213E inline engine. This wasn't just a motor, it was a complex breathing apparatus. It used a two-stage, three-speed supercharger, a mechanical marvel that forced compressed air into the engine, allowing it to breathe at altitudes where others suffocated. And to give it an extra burst, it had the GM1 boost system, injecting nitrous oxide, or laughing gas, directly into the engine, a shot of adrenaline that could briefly push it past its limits. The result? At 41,000 feet, with the boost engaged, the Ta 152H was documented at an astonishing 472 miles per hour. For the Allied pilots in their P-51s and P-47s, this was a phantom, a German fighter that could appear from above, untouchable, strike with a massive 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, and then use its superior climb rate to simply vanish back into the stratosphere. It even had a pressurized cockpit, a rarity that kept its pilot conscious and effective in the brutal cold. But this incredible machine was a prime example of too little, too late. It was complicated to build, and by the time it entered service in January of 1945, Germany's factories were rubble and its supply lines were shattered. Only about 67 were ever built. They saw very little combat, but they left a mark. One of the few aces to fly it, Oberfeldwebel Willy Reschke, famously engaged a flight of Hawker Tempests. The Tempests were superb fighters, but Reschke, low on fuel and cornered, simply used his superior climb and altitude performance to escape. Later, he reportedly engaged 4 P-51 Mustangs at high altitude, shooting down 2 before the others could even react. It was a glimpse of what might have been. A specialized king, built for the thin air, and at those heights, it was almost certainly the fastest prop plane in the sky. But the Americans had their own high-altitude problem. It wasn't just the TA-152. It was the arrival of the ME-262 jet. Suddenly, even the superb P-51D was sluggish. The Army Air Forces needed a jet killer. Their answer was the Republic P-47M Thunderbolt. Now, we all know the P-47, the Jug, a 7-ton monster that could soak up damage that would shred any other fighter and still bring its pilot home. It was tough, but it was heavy. To turn this beast into a high-altitude interceptor, the engineers at Republic had to turn it into a hot rod. They took the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, already a legend, and strapped on a new experimental turbocharger, the CH-5. This new turbo, combined with water injection, could force the engine to produce a staggering 2,800 horsepower in short bursts. This was war emergency power. They also put the plane on a diet, stripping out non-essential equipment and lightening the airframe. The result was a Thunderbolt that looked familiar, but flew like nothing else. This P-47M was designed for one unit and one unit only, the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, the top scoring group in the 8th Air Force. They were the aces, and they were the only ones who got this hot rod. In level flight, at 30,000 feet, the P-47M could hit 472 miles per hour. It was a brute force solution. Where the TA-152 was a finessed, high-altitude scalpel, the P-47M was a sledgehammer. It could use that speed to dive on the new German jets as they were taking off or landing, their most vulnerable moments. It retained the legendary 850 caliber machine guns, a wall of lead that could disintegrate anything it hit. But like the TA-152, the P-47M was a temperamental beast. Those new engines were pushed to their absolute limits, and they often failed. Early models were grounded for weeks as maintenance crews worked desperately to fix engine failures. Only 130 were ever built. They arrived in December 1944, and once the engine kinks were worked out, proved to be devastating. They gave American pilots a fighting chance against the jets and could outrun nearly any other piston-engine fighter the Luftwaffe had left. It was the ultimate expression of the Thunderbolt, a true high-altitude champion. High-altitude speed is one thing, but most dogfights, the brutal, turning and burning knife fights, happened between 5,000 and 20,000 feet. Here, a different kind of speed was needed. Not just top-end velocity, but acceleration, the ability to pounce. This brings us to a familiar name, the Focke-Wulf FW-190D9. The original Focke-Wulf 190, the Butcher Bird, had shocked the Allies in 1941. It was a radial engine brute that outclassed the Spitfire Mark V in almost every way. But, as we mentioned, its BMW radial engine struggled at high altitude. By 1943, the tide was turning. Kurt Tank's solution, before the TA-152 was ready, was an interim stopgap. He took the rugged FW-190 airframe and did something radical. He replaced the air-cooled radial engine with a liquid-cooled inline V12, the Jumo 213A. This completely changed the aircraft. To keep the center of gravity, the engine had to be mounted far forward, requiring a long extension. This gave it its famous nickname, the Dora, or long nose. The Dora wasn't just a modified fighter, it was a new breed. It was sleek, powerful, and fast. At 21,000 feet, it was cleared for 426 miles per hour. This new engine transformed the 190 from a low-altitude brawler into a true high-performance energy fighter. It could climb better and dive faster than its radial engine brothers. It was a pilot's plane, retaining the incredible roll rate and heavy armament of the original. But now it had the speed to match the latest Allied fighters. When it appeared in the fall of 1944, it was a nasty shock to P-51 and Spitfire pilots who thought they had the measure of the 190. The Dora could meet them on its own terms, using its speed to dictate the fight. It was arguably the best all-around piston fighter the Luftwaffe produced in large numbers during the final year of the war. About 1,800 were built, and they fought desperately in the defense of Germany. But the Allies had a response, and it was one of the most powerful fighters of the entire war, the Hawker Tempest Mark V. The British had their own problem. The Hawker Typhoon, while a fantastic ground attack aircraft, was too thick and heavy to be a top-tier dogfighter. Its designer, Sidney Cam, went back to the drawing board. He took the Typhoon's monstrous engine, the 2,200 horsepower Napier Sabre, and married it to a brand new, much thinner laminar flow wing. The result was the Tempest, and it was a brute. The Napier Sabre engine was a 24-cylinder marvel, an H-block engine that was incredibly complex and, in its early days, notoriously unreliable. But when it worked, it produced a sound unlike anything else in the sky, a deep, tearing canvas roar that was terrifying. The Tempest Mark V could hit 435 miles per hour at 19,000 feet. But its real party trick was down low. It was one of the fastest aircraft of the war at sea level, making it the perfect weapon for a new, terrifying threat that emerged in 1944. The V-1 flying bomb. These buzz bombs were small, jet-powered cruise missiles, and they flew low and fast, too fast for most Allied fighters to catch. But the Tempest could. Tempest squadrons were let loose and they became the V-1's worst nightmare. Pilots would dive to intercept, cannons blazing. Some, like the famous ace Joseph Barry, would even fly alongside the V-1 and use their own wingtip to flip the V-1's wing, toppling its primitive gyroscope and sending it crashing into the countryside. But it was also a deadly fighter. In air combat, it was a beast. It could outdive almost anything. It was fast, heavily armed with 4 20mm cannons, and surprisingly agile for its size. In the final year of the war, Tempest squadrons tore through the Luftwaffe, racking up kills against FW-190s and ME-109s, and even claimed over 20 of the new ME-262 jets. And that brings us to the midway point of our journey. We've seen some of the most specialized and powerful aircraft ever built. Let me ask you, of the planes we've covered so far, which one would you have trusted your life to in a dogfight? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. It's always fascinating to read the first-hand experience and opinions many of you have. Now we must talk about a legend. When most people think of Allied fighters, one beautiful elliptical wing comes to mind. The Supermarine Spitfire. But the Spitfire that won the Battle of Britain in 1940 was not the same plane that flew in 1945. The original was a delicate, precise fencing foil. The late-war Spitfire was a broadsword. The problem was that the Spitfire's beloved Merlin engine, while a masterpiece, was reaching its developmental limit. The answer was a new engine, the Rolls-Royce Griffon. The Griffon was a monster. It was a V12, just like the Merlin, but it was 33% larger. Where the original Merlin produced 1,000 horsepower, the Griffon 65 engine in the Spitfire Mark 14 produced over 2,050 horsepower. This was a heart transplant, and it changed everything. All that new power and torque meant the plane wanted to rip itself to the left on takeoff. To counter it, engineers had to add a massive new, taller tail fin and rudder. It now sported a giant 5-bladed propeller to turn all that power into thrust. This new Spitfire was a rocket ship. It entered service in early 1944 and was an absolute revelation. It could climb at over 5,000 feet per minute, and its top speed, 448 miles per hour. Suddenly, the Spitfire was back on top. It was faster than the standard FW-190s and ME-109s. It was one of the few planes that could reliably intercept high-altitude German reconnaissance aircraft. And like the Tempest, it was a fearsome V-1 hunter. But more importantly, it was a superb dogfighter. It combined the classic Spitfire agility with raw, brute-force American muscle. Pilots loved it. It was a war winner that had been reborn, an old soldier given new life, and it became one of the most respected and feared Allied fighters of the entire war. While the war in Europe was a high-altitude arms race, the war in the Pacific was a different theater entirely. Fights were often at lower altitudes, and the distances were vast. But the most critical moments happened in the first few minutes of an engagement. The scramble. When a Japanese air raid was detected, carrier-based fighters had to get from a cold start on the deck to 20,000 feet in minutes. Climb rate was life. And the Grumman Iron Works, builders of the tough-as-nails F8F Wildcat and the dominant F6F Hellcat, took on this challenge. Their philosophy was simple, and it was classically American. Build the smallest, lightest airframe possible, and then bolt the biggest, most powerful engine they could find to the front of it. The result was the Grumman F8F Bearcat. This airplane was a masterpiece of minimalist, brute force design. The engine was the same Pratt & Whitney R2800 that powered the Hellcat and the Thunderbolt. But the Bearcat itself was 20% lighter than the Hellcat. It was tiny, built around the pilot and the engine. It was so light and so powerful that its performance numbers still seem staggering today. The Bearcat could climb to 10,000 feet in just 94 seconds. That's a climb rate of over 6,300 feet per minute. It was faster than almost any jet of its day. In a dogfight, it could outturn and outclimb anything the Japanese had, including the legendary Zero. And its top speed was a blistering 455 miles per hour. The Bearcat was the ultimate expression of the carrier interceptor. It was small, incredibly fast, agile, and still packed a heavy punch with 4 20mm cannons, but its story is one of tragic timing. The first F8F squadron became operational in February 1945, but the war in the Pacific was winding down. Japan's carrier fleet was at the bottom of the ocean, and its air force was depleted. By the time Japan surrendered in August, the Bearcat had arrived at the front, but it had never seen a single day of combat in World War II. It was, perhaps, the finest carrier fighter of the propeller age, arriving just as the war ended. In the post-war years, it became the mount for the Blue Angels and set climb rate records that stood for decades. But it remains one of the great what-ifs of the Pacific War. We've now seen the kings of high altitude and the brawlers of the mid-levels. But there was one aircraft, built in the final, desperate days of the Third Reich that was cut from a completely different cloth. It was an aircraft that broke all the rules. The engineers at Dornier faced a fundamental problem. One engine was good, but two engines were better. The problem was, putting two engines on the wings, like in a P-38 Lightning or a Mosquito, created immense drag. It made the aircraft a huge target and reduced its roll rate. Their solution was one of the most innovative and strangest designs of the war. The Dornier Do 335, nicknamed the Feel, or Arrow. This was a push-pull fighter. It had two engines, but they were both mounted in the fuselage, one in the front pulling, and one behind the cockpit pushing. The concept was genius. It gave the plane the power of a twin-engine heavy fighter, but with the slim, low-drag profile of a single-engine plane. The two Daimler-Benz DB603 engines gave it a combined 3,500 horsepower. And the result was, simply, the fastest piston-engine aircraft to ever fly in Germany. In level flight, the Do 335 was clocked by Allied test pilots at 474 miles per hour. This thing was a monster. It was fast. It was heavily armed with a 30mm cannon and two 20mm cannons, and it was built to last. It was so advanced, it featured one of the very first production ejection seats, because bailing out meant facing that giant propeller at the tail. But this complexity was its doom. It was a nightmare to manufacture. Development delays meant the first production aircraft were only just starting to reach test units in early 1945. Germany was collapsing. Bombing had shattered the supply chains. Perhaps only 37 were ever completed. None saw true air-to-air combat. They were so fast that when Allied fighters spotted them, the Do 335 pilots were simply instructed to apply full power and fly away, which they did with ease. No Allied propeller fighter could catch it. It was an engineering marvel, a glimpse into a parallel future of aviation. But it was a phantom. It couldn't be the true king of speed, because it never truly fought for the crown. It remains the fastest German prop plane of the war, but not the ultimate champion. That leaves us with one. The final and absolute fastest propeller-driven fighter of the Second World War. By 1944, the North American P-51D Mustang was the master of the skies over Europe. It had the range to fly to Berlin and back, and the performance to defeat the Luftwaffe when it got there. It was, many believe, the most perfectly balanced fighter of the war. But the engineers at North American knew they could do better. They saw the new German jets, they saw the high-altitude TA-152s, and they saw the brutal power of the new Tempest and Bearcats. They decided to take their war-winning design and push it to the absolute limit. The result was not just another variant. It was a complete top-to-bottom redesign. This was the North American P-51H Mustang. The P-51H was an exercise in lightness. The D model was tough, but the H model was a purebred racer. Engineers went over every single component. They redesigned the fuselage, simplified the structure, and stripped out nearly 1,500 pounds of weight from the airframe. Then, they gave it more power. They took the superb Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and upgraded it to the V1650-9 model. This new Merlin had a more advanced supercharger and, crucially, a water injection system for war emergency power. It could produce over 2,200 horsepower, a lighter airframe, a more powerful engine, and the most advanced aerodynamic design of the war. The result was the King. In official flight tests, the P-51H Mustang achieved a top speed of 487 miles per hour in level flight at 25,000 feet. This was it. The absolute pinnacle of piston-engine fighter design. It was nearly 50 miles per hour faster than the P-51D that most pilots flew. It wasn't just fast at the top end. That weight reduction transformed its handling. It could climb faster, roll faster, and turn tighter than any Mustang before it. It retained the P-51's legendary long range, meaning it could fly from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, fight, and fly all the way back. It was designed for the invasion of Japan. It was the plane that would have met the last of Japan's fighters over their homeland. But like the Bearcat, its timing meant it missed the war. Production began in February 1945. By the time Japan surrendered in August, 555 had been built, but none had seen combat. They arrived just as the jet age was beginning, but the records stand. While the TA-152H may have been faster at extreme altitude, and the DO-335 was a what-if marvel, the P-51H was the fastest all-around production fighter to come out of the war. It was the perfect final expression of a design that had already achieved immortality. So, who was the king of speed? As we've seen, there is no single, simple answer. Was it the TA-152H, the thin-wing specialist that ruled the stratosphere at 472 miles per hour? Was it the DO-335, the bizarre arrow that proved a push-pull design could hit an incredible 474 miles per hour, even if it never had the chance to prove it in a fight? Or was it the P-51H Mustang, the ultimate American thoroughbred, stripped and supercharged to achieve a documented 487 miles per hour, the fastest of them all? The truth is, all of these machines were masterpieces. They were designed by engineers and flown by pilots who were pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible, all while under the relentless pressure of a world at war. Just 61 miles per hour separated our number 8 plane from our number 1. In that tiny margin, thousands of hours of engineering and the lives of countless men were spent. Speed wasn't everything, of course. The agility of the Spitfire, the toughness of the Thunderbolt, the climb rate of the Bearcat, these all mattered just as much. But in a war where seconds meant survival, where catching an enemy before he could bomb or escaping to fight another day was the only thing that mattered, speed was the ultimate weapon.